By mid-1944, General Douglas MacArthur has fought his way across 2,000 miles of Pacific Ocean, from the jungles of New Guinea to the doorstep of the Philippines. 2 years earlier, he had fled those islands on a PT boat in the dead of night, ordered out by President Roosevelt as the Japanese closed in. On the dock at Corregidor, surrounded by men he was leaving behind to die or surrender, he made a promise that would define the rest of his war: "I shall return." Now, in the summer of 1944, he intends to keep that promise, but not alone. MacArthur wants the United States Pacific Fleet, nearly all of it, placed under his command to retake the Philippines. He wants the carriers, he wants the battleships, he wants the amphibious forces. He wants Admiral Chester Nimitz's entire Central Pacific war machine redirected to serve one objective: his return. The Navy sees things very differently. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, believes the Philippines should be bypassed entirely. His plan is bolder and colder. Seize Formosa, cut Japan off from the oil, rubber, and raw materials of Southeast Asia, starve the empire into surrender without ever setting foot in Manila. King's logic is naval logic: control the sea lanes and the war ends. The Philippines are a sideshow, a costly, time-consuming sideshow driven by one man's personal promise. Admiral Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, shares much of King's strategic reasoning. He has built the most powerful naval force in history: fast carriers, modern battleships, veteran amphibious crews, and he has no intention of handing it to an army general. Nimitz does not say this loudly. He does not make speeches. He simply makes his position clear through the chain of command. The fleet stays under naval authority. But this is not purely a military question. It is 1944, an election year. Franklin Roosevelt is running for an unprecedented fourth term as president, and Douglas MacArthur is not merely a general, he is a political force. Conservative Republicans have openly courted him as a presidential candidate. He has quietly encouraged their attention. Roosevelt knows that MacArthur commands loyalty not only among his troops, but among millions of American voters, voters who remember his promise to the Filipino people, voters who see the liberation of the Philippines as a sacred national obligation. Roosevelt cannot afford to overrule MacArthur publicly, but he also cannot allow a general to dictate naval strategy. The result is an extraordinary decision. The President of the United States will personally travel to Hawaii to sit between his two most powerful Pacific commanders and broker a resolution. The stakes are not merely strategic, they are political, and MacArthur knows it. On July 26, 1944, Roosevelt arrives at Pearl Harbor aboard the cruiser USS Baltimore. Nimitz is there to meet him. MacArthur is not, at least not yet. The general has been ordered to attend, and he is furious. He calls it a picture-taking junket. When he finally arrives, he does so in a long open limousine with a full motorcycle escort, waving to cheering crowds. It is pure theater, and it is deliberate. MacArthur intends to remind everyone, including the president, that he is the most famous soldier in America. That evening, aboard the Baltimore, the three most powerful men in the Pacific War sit down together. There is no written record of what is said, but the argument that follows will determine the fate of the largest fleet ever assembled and the lives of nearly 200,000 men. MacArthur speaks first, and he speaks at length. His argument is part military strategy, part moral obligation, part political threat. The Philippines are American territory, he insists. 17 million Filipinos are suffering under Japanese occupation. American prisoners of war, survivors of Bataan and Corregidor, are starving in Japanese camps. The United States has a constitutional responsibility to liberate them. To bypass the Philippines would be, in MacArthur's words, to leave blood on America's soul. But MacArthur leaves certain details unspoken. He does not mention that a Philippines campaign will be long and costly, potentially months of brutal island-by-island fighting across an archipelago of 7,000 islands. He does not mention that his plan requires the entire Third Fleet to operate under his strategic direction. And he does not mention the obvious, that this is personal. Nimitz's response is quieter and more precise. He presents the case for Formosa. Seizing the island would place American forces closer to the Japanese home islands than Luzon. It would sever Japan's supply lines more efficiently. It would open a direct link to China, allowing resupply of Chinese forces fighting the Japanese on the mainland. And critically, it would not require the Navy to subordinate its command structure to an Army general who has never commanded a fleet action. Nimitz does not attack MacArthur directly. That is not his way. Admiral William Leyte, Roosevelt's chief of staff and an observer at the conference, later writes that it is both pleasant and very informative to have these two men who had been pictured as antagonists calmly present their differing views. But beneath the calm, the stakes are absolute. Nimitz is telling MacArthur and Roosevelt that the Pacific Fleet will not be handed over. The Navy's carriers, its battleships, its veteran crews, they stay under naval command. The real battle is not between strategies. It is between chains of command. Since 1942, the Pacific War has been fought under a divided structure. MacArthur commands the Southwest Pacific area, ground forces, his own 7th Fleet, land-based air power. Nimitz commands the Pacific Ocean areas, the main Pacific Fleet, the fast carriers, the Central Pacific Offensive. The two commands operate side by side, but independently. Neither man reports to the other. MacArthur has long chafed under this arrangement. He wants unified command under himself. He has repeatedly demanded that the entire fleet and all amphibious forces be placed under his authority. King and Nimitz have repeatedly refused. The Navy's position is clear. Command of the fleet is inseparable from control of the fleet. You cannot give an Army general strategic direction of carrier task forces and expect naval officers to execute it without naval oversight. The Pacific Fleet is not a taxi service for ground operations. It is a warfighting instrument with its own doctrine, its own traditions, and its own chain of command. Roosevelt makes no decision at Hawaii. He listens, he smiles, he takes photographs, and then he goes home. But on August 9th, MacArthur receives a letter from the president. Roosevelt writes that he will push forward with the plan MacArthur recommended, meaning the Philippines. MacArthur believes, probably correctly, that Roosevelt has sided with him for political reasons. It is an election year. The general's conservative supporters are too powerful to alienate. But Roosevelt has not given MacArthur everything he wants. The fleet will support the Philippines campaign, but it will not be placed under MacArthur's command. Nimitz's 3rd Fleet, under Admiral William Halsey, will provide cover. MacArthur's 7th Fleet, under Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, will handle the amphibious operations. 2 fleets, 2 chains of command, 2 admirals reporting to 2 different superiors, Halsey to Nimitz, Kinkaid to MacArthur. It is a compromise designed to satisfy everyone. It will nearly destroy them all. October 20th, 1944. American forces land on the island of Leyte in the central Philippines. 130,000 troops of General Walter Kruger's 6th Army pour onto the beaches under the protection of the largest naval armada ever assembled. MacArthur wades ashore in knee-deep water, turns to a radio microphone, and addresses the Filipino people. I have returned. Behind him, 2 enormous American fleets are positioned to shield the invasion. Halsey's 3rd Fleet, 8 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 6 fast battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers guards the approaches from the north and east. Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, 6 old battleships, 18 escort carriers, and a screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts protects the landing beaches directly. Together, they represent over 216 warships. It is the most powerful concentration of naval force in history, but the 2 fleets answer to different commanders, and they cannot talk directly to each other. In Japan, Admiral Soemu Toyoda sees an opportunity, the only one the Imperial Japanese Navy has left. The Show 1 plan is a desperate gamble built on one insight. The Americans have split their fleet between 2 commands that do not coordinate directly. Toyoda plans to exploit the gap. The plan calls for 3 separate Japanese naval forces to converge on Leyte Gulf simultaneously. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built, will punch through the San Bernardino Strait from the west. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force will attack through the Surigao Strait from the south, and Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force, 4 aircraft carriers with almost no aircraft, will dangle itself as bait to lure Halsey's 3rd Fleet away from the landing beaches. It is suicide for the decoy force. But if it works, Kurita's battleships will reach the transports and the beachhead. MacArthur's invasion will be trapped. On October 23rd, the Battle of Leyte Gulf begins. Over the next 3 days, it unfolds across 100,000 square miles of ocean in 4 separate engagements. the largest naval battle in history. Nearly 200,000 men and 282 ships are involved. Nishimura's southern force is annihilated in the Surigao Strait by Kinkaido's old battleships, a textbook crossing of the T. But on the morning of October 25th, the catastrophe MacArthur's divided command has made possible nearly arrives. Halsey takes the bait. He races north with every ship in the Third Fleet to pursue Ozawa's decoy carriers, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. No one tells Kinkaid. The two fleets cannot communicate directly. MacArthur has forbidden it. Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers, pours through the unguarded strait and bears down on the landing beaches. All that stands between Kurita and the destruction of the American invasion is Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Thin-skinned ships never designed for surface combat against battleships. What happens next is the most extraordinary last stand in naval history. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 charge directly at Kurita's battleships, firing torpedoes and 5-inch guns against ships carrying 18-inch turrets. The escort carriers launch every aircraft they have. The ferocity of the attack is so intense that Japanese lookouts misidentify the tiny escort carriers as fleet carriers and the destroyers as heavy cruisers. Kurita, believing he has encountered a major portion of the Third Fleet, hesitates, then withdraws. The cost is devastating. The destroyers Johnston and Hull are sunk. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts is sunk. The escort carrier Gambier Bay goes down, the only American carrier sunk by naval gunfire in the entire war. The escort carrier, St. Lo, is destroyed by a kamikaze, the first major warship lost to the tactic that will define the war's final months. But the beachhead holds. MacArthur's invasion survives. From Pearl Harbor, Nimitz sends Halsey a message that will become one of the most famous signals in naval history. Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ends the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. Japanese losses are staggering. 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, and over 10,000 men. The fleet that had dominated the Western Pacific for 3 years limps back to port and never sails again in force. Only the desperate suicide mission of the Yamato 7 months later at Okinawa remains. American losses are far lighter, but the margin of survival is razor thin. The divided command structure that MacArthur demanded and Roosevelt permitted has nearly handed Japan the greatest American naval disaster since Pearl Harbor. Had Kurita pressed his attack at Samar instead of withdrawing, the 7th Fleet's transports and MacArthur's entire invasion force would have been exposed to the most powerful surface gunnery force in the world. The question that remains is not whether MacArthur's strategy was wrong. Military historians generally agree that liberating the Philippines made strategic sense. Cutting Japan off from its southern resources was a valid objective. The question is whether MacArthur's insistence on controlling the fleet and the fractured command structure that resulted from the compromise nearly cost the Allies a catastrophe that no strategic objective could justify. MacArthur had forbidden direct radio communication between the 3rd and 7th Fleets during the amphibious operations. He had demanded that his own choice of naval officers command the amphibious formations Nimitz was loaning him. He had insisted that Kinkaid was in no way to recognize Halsey's seniority if the admiral attempted to direct his operations. Every one of these decisions widened the gap between the two fleets, the same gap that Toyota's Show 1 plan was designed to exploit. Nimitz never said, "I told you so." That was not his nature. In December 1944, he was promoted to Fleet Admiral, 5 stars, in recognition of the campaign that had broken Japan's naval power. He continued to direct the Pacific Fleet through the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, operations that would have been impossible if the fleet had been fractured under MacArthur's command structure. MacArthur, promoted to General of the Army the same month, continued his campaign across the Philippines. It would take until the war's end to clear the archipelago, a campaign that cost over 10,000 American lives and more than 36,000 wounded. Some military historians argue that many of those casualties were unnecessary, the result of MacArthur's insistence on liberating every island rather than bypassing Japanese garrisons that no longer posed a strategic threat. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Admiral Chester Nimitz signs the instrument of Japanese surrender on behalf of the United States. MacArthur presides over the ceremony as Supreme Commander. The two men stand side by side, the general who demanded the fleet and the admiral who refused to give it. The Pacific War is over. 282 ships fought at Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. The fleet that Nimitz kept under naval command destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, 3 battleships, and dozens of escorts. The fleet that MacArthur controlled nearly lost the entire invasion to a communication gap that both men knew existed and neither had the authority to fix. Whether Roosevelt's compromise saved the alliance or nearly lost the war depends on which moment you choose to remember: MacArthur wading ashore at Leyte or the destroyers of Taffy 3 charging battleships they had no business fighting, buying time that should never have needed buying.